Oh, hey, Jennifer.
Hello, good morning or afternoon, I guess, depending on where folks are.
Yes, we really have all over. I mean, it's around 3:30 for me, and I know for Karen and Sophie, it's way, way earlier. Well,
Hi
hello to
there.
everyone who can or is here today and joining us. Feel free to turn your cameras on if you'd like, but also no pressure to do so. This is, an informal conversation between, key stakeholders in the period poverty arena. And today we're really going to talk about civil society and how we can all organize together to mobilize and to fight for period poverty, to fight to end period poverty. And the different ways in doing so. So just a little bit about International Advocacy Day to end period poverty. So International Advocacy Day is all centered around achieving gender justice through the issues of period poverty and menstrual health. And we know that driven by poverty and inequality, stigma and violence, access to resources, products, information that's often unavailable to those who need it the most. For too long, patriarchal institutions have prevented all who menstruate from exercising their human rights and dismissed the significance of period poverty from the political agenda. So IAD is a movement of young leaders from all around the world, from all different countries, focusing on different aspects of what period poverty looks like, raising awareness as to what period poverty is and how they are tackling period poverty through an intersectional and holistic angle. So I'm thrilled today to be talking specifically about civil society and mobilizing for period poverty with these incredible panelists here. So I will just, allow you guys to introduce yourselves and say a little bit about your name, where you're from, and what kind of different elements of period poverty that often go unnoticed, that we don't think about, that are important to you, that you really want audience to leave with. So Karen, I'll pass it to you.
Okay. Hey, I'm Karen Sugar. Good morning, everyone. I'm the Executive Director of Women's Global Empowerment Fund, and I'm in Los Angeles this morning. We work mainly in the northern region of Uganda and other surrounding communities in East Africa. We have a project called the Healthy Periods Initiative. So I've been working on issues around period poverty for about 5 years. It was actually, I have worked in, I've worked in homeless shelters in the shelter system in Atlanta and in Denver, Colorado in my previous life before I started international work. And I knew the need of that kind of population was so great, but I never really understood it from a global perspective. I'd never really taken a deep dive into what period poverty is and all of the layers around it. So I've learned a lot the last 5 years, and it's something that I've just become really passionate about, and our program has really, really been very, very successful and impactful at keeping girls in school, at enabling women to attend work with dignity, and increasing health and awareness and information. We've included boys in our program. So we've kind of done some really unique and groundbreaking work. And so for me, I'm most interested in the most vulnerable communities in the global south, including refugee populations in post-conflict regions and people that really live in under-resourced communities. And I'm happy to be here this morning.
Thank you so much, Karen. Sophie, I will pass it on to you. Oh.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. Shira, thank you so much for having me today. My name is Sophie. I'm one of the co-founders of the PAD Project, which is another menstrual equity nonprofit. We are a youth-founded and youth-led organization. We were founded by a group of high school students and our English teacher. And to this day, the majority of our staff and team members are below the age of 30. And most of us are still in college, myself included. We work primarily on an international scale, working with communities who have reached out to us, and we form partnerships with local NGOs and install either manual pad making machines or washable cloth pad programs in partnership with menstrual health management workshops. And through this process of both increased access to period care products and menstrual education, we are able to see an increase in girls staying in school, women being able to stay with higher paying jobs, an increase in dignity, as Karen was saying, and an all around reduction in stigma, which is one of the things that we have seen to be the most harmful and the most pervasive around the globe, as well as a bunch of advocacy work that we do here in the US. And we are also the organization behind the documentary Period End of Sentence, which can be found on Netflix and won the 2019 Academy Award for Documentary Short, which depicted our partnership with a nonprofit in Kathakira, India, and the installation of a pad machine there. And I'm also very excited to be here.
Awesome. That was great. Thank you so much. And Sia from Girl Up, I'd love for you to just explain a bit about who you are and tell us what elements of period poverty you find most interesting.
Sure. Thank you, Shira, for having me. Hi, everyone. I'm delighted to be here. I am a senior director for global community with Girl Up, which is a global girls leadership movement. We are engaging about 85,000 girls through 4,500 clubs in 125 countries. Many of those clubs have been taking on the issue of period poverty, and we're beginning to look at it as a real, an area of advocacy that we need to be supporting and growing. I'll also be, because I'm relatively new to Girl Up, I'll also be drawing on some of my experiences in my previous position as executive director of the 3D program for girls and women, where we were working in Maharashtra state in India, basically working with local government and elevating girls and women's voices to actually speak to the effectiveness of government programs and services, including menstrual hygiene management services and sanitation and wash services and health and education. So that was really how menstrual equity basically became a priority for me, beginning to see how it was popping up across sectors and how those sectors really don't speak to each other. So it really was falling between the cracks. And I know we'll be talking about that a little bit later. But for me, I think the one element of period poverty that I feel is often overlooked, because a lot of the advocacy is being done with underserved populations, with the most vulnerable, with the most underprivileged people, the ideas of quality and choice are sort of taken off the table, right? So this idea that, okay, if we just throw any kind of quality pad at a community, we've done our jobs. And anyone who has menstruated knows if a method fails us, we stop using it. We are often using different methods depending on the day of our period, what our period looks like, where we are in the world, if we're staying home or if we're going out. And so I really feel like we need to add those ideas, those issues of quality and choice, and really talking about addressing period poverty in a way that we would all want it addressed for ourselves. And I am just delighted to be here and looking forward to more. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Sia. And actually, that's a great time for me to just plug another one of our events we have coming up, which is called Mother Nature Bleeds Too. And it's just talking about how by taking a holistic approach to period poverty, we're focusing on the environmental impacts and the health impacts of kind of period products. No one should have to decide whether to spend their money on a meal or a pad, or whether they're going to hold the responsibility of affecting the environment or take care of their menstrual health, or, you know, get toxic shock syndrome or endometriosis instead of period products. So come to that event on the 15th. Jennifer, I would love for you to just come in and talk about your work at Period Equity.
Hi, good morning, everybody. And I'm warning from the start, I have some weird laryngitis going on. So my voice is just, it's a little strange sounding. But good morning, I'm in New York City, so it's morning here, or mid-morning here. And I'm really excited to meet you all and to be able to participate in this conversation too. So what's so fascinating to me actually about hearing everybody's introduction is what a different angle we each come at it from, and how all of that is sort of necessary to have a holistic movement and a meaningful movement. So my interest and perspective is actually pretty narrow. I'm a lawyer and a policy expert and a writer, and those are the sort of three disciplines I've kind of chosen to bring to this issue. And my own history or footprint in this movement is probably more recent than many. I came in 2015, and upon sort of just hearing, a basic, case of lack of menstrual access in my own community, and a collection drive was being started actually by 2 kids in my community for a local food pantry. My reaction to it at the time was one of sort of shock that we would not have policies in place such that if a public service agency had this need, it wasn't being funded, but rather relying on kids to go out in their community and collect the things that were needed. And I really wanted to get to the bottom of what was going on in our policies and why menstruation was so overlooked. I mean, the answer was, I guess, mostly obvious why it was overlooked. We all know sort of the steep history of generations of stigma that have and exclusion that have surrounded it. But it struck me as a really doable thing to ask our lawmakers to consider menstruation, and then come up with ways that were viable. So basically, early on in 2015, I came up with a sort of a policy menu that was focused on U.S. lawmaking, understanding that some of this was already happening globally, but it would still require a different vocabulary and different approach to get U.S. lawmakers to even hear the problem, accept and understand the problem, and then be willing on both sides of the aisle to legislate to help solve the problem. And the problem being, kind of multifaceted. Period poverty is one umbrella to talk about it. Menstrual equity is the frame and phrase that I've always used, partly because it was intended to, it's funny when people ask about it now, I say when I started using it at the time in 2015, I never kind of pictured it to be like sort of an organizing principle as much as a frame that legislators could wrap their heads around. And when I say legislators, I mostly mean Republican legislators in our very sort of partisan and polarized toxic politics. I assumed that Democrats would hang on, latch on to this pretty quickly. It meets most of their talking points. I figured Republicans might recoil from it, and equity was a way to hearken to principles and vocabulary that they were perhaps more comfortable using: equitable access to education, ability to participate in the economy. So it was actually kind of intended in a narrow way when I started using it, but it's really fascinating to me to see how it's become sort of not necessarily synonymous with, but integrated with the idea of period poverty and public health and all of the different, and human rights and all the different ways we might approach this issue. So anyway, that's my story. I'm focused again largely on U.S. policymaking, and I'm not even an organizer or really an advocate. I'm not the best person to be advocating for change in Colorado or Nebraska or Florida. It's people on the ground who live in those communities who really need to be demanding that change. But I consider myself sort of this this standalone brain that exists in New York City that can help sort of crank out ideas and models that others can then adapt. I just want to share real quickly, big fan of the PAD project. And I don't know if Sophie and I have met in person, but I've met various folks, and I'm very proud to have this in hand right now. I have the Galley, the Advanced Readers Edition of Period End of Sentence, which is the book that Anita Diamant is writing about, rooted in the experience of meeting the folks from the PAD project. And I'm going to get to review it. I'm very excited. So anyway, I was reading it last night, very exciting, it's very beautiful. And folks might know that I wrote this book, Periods Gone Public, back in 2017, again, sort of speaking to this policy and public agenda that has been the way I've chosen to immerse myself in this universe of menstruation.
I'm just gonna say you saw a galley, but well before I did. That's so exciting. And
All
also,
right, I got that yesterday from Simon Schuster, and I have to say I pretty much devoured it last night. Now I need to read it more carefully. Last night I gave it like the full read through.
very exciting.
Well, thank you so much, Jen. And a lot of what you're speaking to is kind of the taboo and stigmatization of period poverty, and kind of even why we have to use those terms like menstrual equity to even make it a topic that's digestible or attractive to lawmakers. And kind of we're seeing like lawmakers not wanting to champion period poverty legislation. So like trying to find ways to make it attractive or to like the politicians. Well, I would love to just see if Mishi is here, if she wants to introduce herself. I don't see her on here. I didn't know if she was on a different name or something. Anyways, hopefully we'll be able to have a one-on-one conversation with her, and we'll get you guys what she has to bring to the discussion. So jumping straight in here to some of our moderated questions. So I just wanted to first talk like how has menstruation, how has menstruation been discussed or approached in the past throughout history, or whether it's recent history or on like our global levels, local levels, regional levels, and what lessons can we learn from their strategies that they've tried to implement and their successes and failures? And then also, what do the strategies that they've tried to already implement, and whether it's failed or success or been a success, what does that tell us about how actors kind of conceptualize period poverty and problematize it? And then how they generate solutions, what the framework is. And feel free to just jump in there. I know it's a lot of concepts within that question.
I mean, I think the first answer that comes to mind for me is that historically there really hasn't been any conceptualization of period poverty on a global scale. I know, I mean, like historically as a very broad concept. I think mostly due to the stigmatization of periods and the fact that in every single of our like kind of greatest and broadest historical texts, including the Old Testament, the Quran, the first Latin encyclopedia, the Mahabharata. I'm sure I'm saying that wrong, but the like some of the texts that ground the largest societies in our globe, menstruation periods are literally codified as unnatural, as unclean, as evil, as something that can turn new wine sour, as something that should be like kept away from crops, as something that means that women cannot be in temples, cannot pray. And so you see a foundation very early on in society's earliest foundations that really sets up this these foundations of really separate and unequal access to life for people who menstruate. And it's so therefore it's no surprise that we have not really ever tackled period poverty as a global community, because we are still living under these stigmas and these perceptions of shame, because we haven't really ever addressed what they really mean on a deeper level. And I think we're finally starting to. I think especially my generation and some of the younger folks in the room are starting to kind of speak more loudly and proudly about their periods, which is awesome. But like even when I first got my period, I kind of whispered it really quietly. And a lot of the pride that I talk about my period with came from my own advocacy work. And that had to be learned. It was not innate. And as well, I think that what is really interesting is that period poverty is related to every other possible avenue of policy and of equity work. I mean, it's about the gender gap in education. It's about like racial equity work. It's about classism and class disparity. It's about LGBTQ rights. It's about like period poverty is so interconnected to every other form of inequity in our societies, because half the population bleeds, and we are, as individuals, so deeply interconnected through multifaceted identities, and you can't really separate them. And so I find it interesting when people come at talking about period poverty, menstrual equity as kind of a women's rights issue, because yes, it is. On paper, it's very easy to classify it as just a women's rights issue, but it's also a labor rights issue. You could very easily talk about it in terms of not giving Amazon workers bathroom breaks in warehouses, and the fact that Jeff Bezos is, denying people basic human liberties. And it's also LGBTQ rights issues, because trans women are some of the most targeted people on the planet, and trans men already face issues going to the bathroom in school environments, let alone having to figure out how to take tampons with them. And like, that's a huge issue. So it was a very long-winded answer, but I think it's an incredibly multifaceted issue. And because it takes on all of the aspects of our interconnected identities, which are already at war with each other because we are plagued by so many different isms, it is no wonder that we have not, as a global community, really addressed period poverty before, especially when it's rooted in such shame and stigma.
Yeah. I mean, Eve was the first woman to be demonized for being a woman, right? And somehow she, had the suffering of menstrual suffering and pains during child labor put upon her by God, and she had to be, subservient to her husband. I mean, the original sin right there. And it is rooted in religious dogma and cultural stigma, and it is hard to break. But I mean, Sophie, everything you said was so true, but then in my head I was like, but you know what, this isn't rocket science either. We're not really trying to solve something that like we really don't know what to do, or it's going to take some huge worldwide effort to study and to, I mean, it's fairly simple, and it really is a human right. And we've already designated, health is a human right, and this falls directly into that. So I feel like, as intersectional and layered as this is in its affect, it's also kind of a very simple, there are very simple answers to period poverty, and they should be palatable to the rest of the world when we talk about it, and I do think that just talking about it has made great strides already. I kind of think the first time that I remember periods and having your period and menstruation being something that was kind of mainstream was because all of a sudden, through commercials, like in the 70s, they started Kotex and Kimberly Clark started advertising about this. Otherwise, without that, I don't even know if people would still know about it. I mean, it was like that was I think the foray into men even hearing about it. Other than that, it was, as discussed, like it really wasn't discussed. Just the simple act of it really wasn't discussed. And then you go into communities where, that is not their trajectory, and there's still so much myth and taboo around it, rooted in religiosity and, cultural stigma. That's more pervasive, I think, and stubborn. But in my work, what I've seen is that when men are introduced to the topic, they tend to really be open and embrace it and understand it, and you kind of see things change. So again, I think that this isn't something that we don't know how to work on. It's just a matter of making that decision that we're going to put it on the table in front of everybody and discuss it all and make it all happen.
I would agree with Karen that, in our experiences with government officials, mostly men in Maharashtra state, that there was really an openness and a willingness to, and a recognition that this is an issue that has to be addressed. The harder part was, how do we do it? And because, as Sophie says, this is a women's issue, yes, but it's so much more than that. And so many systems and public services are set up in a siloed way that, Karen, you're saying, of course, it's a health issue and health is a human right. it's a women's issue, it's a school issue, so it's an education issue, it's a water and sanitation issue, it's an environmental issue. And these sectors are not used to talking to each other. And some of what is forcing them to talk to each other is generally the issue of gender equality, because that too is cross-cutting. But I think menstrual equity is posing a real challenge to those systems, because it's about policy, it's about service delivery, it's about supply chains, it's about rights. It's about, it's about talking about things which, as you say, are taboo. And yes, there's a willingness on the surface, but do we really want to hear about the experiences of girls and women? So I think that sort of structure of development and public service systems is getting in the way, despite the willingness and the recognition of the issue. The other thing that I think has shaped the way that menstruation has been discussed and approached is that it's been cast primarily as a girls' issue. So we are all benefiting from the advocacy of girls and young women on this issue. There is no question that that is who is moving the progress forward. But at the same time, it's almost like, oh, okay, we survived our first period, we got our pads or tampons or menstrual cup, and that's the end of it. It's not really viewed as a life cycle issue where our periods change through our life cycles, our needs change, endometriosis is ignored, hormonal fluctuations are ignored in medical research, menopause, my God, completely silent on menopause. So this idea that somehow it's something that is time specific and check that box and then we're done, I think has really been detrimental to how we can actually move past the taboo and stigma to really talking about, okay, it's 50% of the population. And that means a lot of diversity of experience and needs. And how do we begin to talk about those? How do we prioritize what needs to get done immediately? And how do we make sure that the advocacy, the policy, the service delivery systems, the supply chains, the methods, the research, the data is actually speaking to that broad diversity of experience?
Absolutely.
Oh my gosh, so much to react to there. I have to say, I appreciate exponentially sort of the commentary about the full life cycle aspect of focusing on this as an older person in this movement. I'm often sort of quipped as bringing age diversity to panels, which cracks me up because I don't deem myself to be that old, but I'm 53. And I will also share with this group that I submitted a book proposal this week that is the sequel to Periods Gone Public, which is about menopause. And it's about menopause and public policy and proposing a public policy scheme that responds to the needs of older people, particularly in public life, and women and women who no longer menstruate. But the policy, the sort of the intricacy of the policy approach is so fascinating too, because even what you just described, see, it makes so much sense on the global level. And even if you sort of narrow it into one particular nation's policy structure or governance structure, you'll find so many impossible, paths to have to navigate. So here in the US, which is the stuff I know the most about, I can assure you that every time, and it's not even that often, that menstruation is included as part of a framework of an agency or a policy umbrella, education, product safety, health, workplace, you name it. It's either not acknowledged at all, or if it's acknowledged, it's utterly inconsistent with how another agency acknowledges it. The best example would be the FDA, in terms of product transparency and safety, has classified menstrual products a certain way. The classification, which is called a Class 2 medical device, is not important on its face because it's a meaningless made-up classification, but it affords menstrual products pretty low-level oversight by the federal government in terms of transparency and what consumers are allowed to know, and in terms of safety, testing, and communication among agencies about what the testing indicates or what is possible to be shared. I don't know how to say it. But that designation still by the IRS, which is another standing federal agency, is rejected. The IRS rejects the FDA's classification of menstrual products as a class 2 medical device. And you know what words they object to? Medical. They object to the word medical, and they purposefully deemed it a non-medical device. It does not solve a medical problem. And that has enabled them to, for example, exclude menstrual products from inclusion in flexible spending and health savings account allowances, which was just changed by Congress last year, a year ago now, almost exactly, when it passed the CARES Act, the stimulus package last March. But that discrepancy between the IRS tax code and the FDA in the same government, both they're reverse, and both have the effect of being to the detriment of the person who menstruates or the person who uses menstrual products. And that exists from agency to agency to agency. It either isn't spoken of, or it's spoken of inconsistently. So that in and of itself is a challenge to trying to advance new policies, is getting some sort of broad understanding. So I've also been recently working with the new Gender Policy Council that the Biden administration had announced on International Women's Day on Monday, to ask them to order on behalf of the executive that any federal agencies every federal agency is obliged to consider menstruation in its mission. And it's obliged to consider how it approaches menstruation with the people who interact with that agency, whether it's Department of Education, whether it's the Bureau of Prisons, whether it's the FDA. I mean, you name it. I don't know how many of them are. There's a lot. And not just to consider it, but to report back on what their considerations led them to, and then to ensure that their own budgets include addressing menstruation, whether it's products or information or education, and that they direct their budgets to do the same for the population who benefits from or is a benefit, is part of their service distribution. That still is barely going to scratch the damn surface, because most of our laws and most of people in our country are not actually impacted by federal laws, but they're impacted by state laws. And they're impacted by the business their state does, which is wholly separate than the business the federal government does, by and large. So, I mean, this is like, it's a ridiculous amount of work that has to be done to forge solutions, there's my voice again, that have so much clarity. And then one other thing I just want to say, sorry, I know I've gone on for a while, I just got excited, is that even as a policy advocate or a policy developer, there's a lot of critique of the policies themselves. They're not expansive enough. Is the sales tax on menstrual products, 8 cents on the dollar, really the place to put your energy? Because it's not, what is its impact, and what is its collateral impact, and what is its immediate impact? And I think that as a movement, we probably have to come together and have a lot of understanding and faith that everything isn't going to fully push the ball where it needs to go. And a lot of it has to be incremental, just by definition of how shit gets done. You know what I mean? You have to walk before you run. You can't trade the perfect for the good, or whatever cliches you want to throw at it. But there has to be some sort of faith that all these increments together lead to a movement. So one, policy is not the only answer. We all know that. There's many, many other ways that we engage in the world that lead to the cultural and social and societal change that we seek. Policy is just one of them. But two, to remember that we might harm ourselves, I don't know, by critiquing policies that we perceive to be not fully there, or a waste of goodwill because we're not getting the bigger thing. But are you gonna, so there's like a lot of complexity to trusting all the different tentacles of a movement within one nation, let alone globally. So that's a tall order. It's a tall order for all of us. Okay, I'll stop.
I mean, it does have to be somewhat individual for each country, even each community. So where I work in northern Uganda is going to be a different conversation than the conversations we have in Kampala, which is the capital city in Uganda, right? But that doesn't mean that it's necessarily harder. We just have to work smarter. And I think in the United States, it's like every state has to be organized and lobbied and a set of action actions have to be developed according to the state you're in, because it's going to look different in California and Mississippi,
For
as
sure.
you alluded to. But none of it is not valuable, right? Every success is always incremental, and change is hard, and it's painful, and it takes a long time, and we all have to be, patient. And every success is meaningful to getting us to the next step. And definitely, I mean, in the U.S. in the national government, when you're looking at federal law, and we have to change the makeup of the Congress. I mean,
but we also have to understand, I think, that there are certain things that the federal government can do, and there are certain things that the federal government can't do. A question I get asked a lot, or that people are really eager to understand better, is why, for example, in the U.S. food, various benefit programs that are heavily relied upon by many low-income populations, including food stamps, including WIC, don't include provision of menstrual products. And the answer is really unsatisfactory to a lot of people. The answer is that they're agricultural programs, and agricultural programs by definition don't include products and interactions that aren't agricultural. But that answer stinks. Like, that doesn't make any sense for how a person pushes their cart down the grocery store aisle. But that still is what we're stuck with.
Yeah.
And I think what's really important to remember is that at the end of the day, as advocates and as like NGO partners, what to me has been a really guiding tenet of our work is to respond to demonstrated need, because as you're all pointing out, government takes a long time to get things done. And as we sit here, there are billions of people around the world without access to period care products, who are having increased infections, and who cannot go to school, and who cannot work, and who are sitting there without what I consider to be a basic level of, dignity and care for their own bodies. And so I think, combining the policy pushing and the advocacy and the on the ground work is, at the end of the day, what is most important, because everything takes time. And as Sia was saying, it's like, even when you have the people in government who initially respond really well and say, like, yes, we'd like to do that, but they're not used to talking to their counterparts in other departments. I mean, we've encountered many, many instances in different parts of India where communities have reached out to us and said, hey, like, our local government ministries have said that we, through the Indian government, should be getting pads delivered, but we don't know where they are. And because they had reached out to us and said, you wanted a pad machine, and we said, okay, great. And then after doing some digging with NGOs, trying to see if, like, it was a viable partnership, blah, 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 NGO work. It's really boring a lot of the time, guys. And we figured out that, yes, the Indian government had promised pads to them through an act that was passed a couple years ago. But because none of these ministries were able to talk to each other, because they just weren't used to it, the pads were sitting in boxes in a warehouse half a country away. And they were doing no one any good, because no one had followed through on the supply chain, and they were never delivered. And even if they were delivered, this community was so used to using cloth rags, if that, and the pads were not going to come with anyone doing workshops explaining why disposable pads were a better alternative, that there would have been very low community adoption of the program. And so, yes, all of these policies are impossible and important, and each of them does need to be passed. But at the same time, it's really important that we're continually responding to demonstrated need, because as Karen mentioned, like, every single community is going to need a different piece of like legislation and a different piece of on the ground work, whether that's washable cloth pad programs, whether that's the social enterprise of a manual pad machine, whether that's in the US or other more developed communities, like physical product donations. Like, it really, I don't know, to me, through our work, responding to very much displayed need, and after like spending time in the community, has been our most successful work to date. And by successful, I mean like community adoption to the program, people who have stayed using pads instead of going back to cloth rags, the highest rate of girls going back to school, the highest rate of people who have said that they no longer feel shame about their periods, who are more open to talking about it, who feel more empowered talking about their bodies. So I think I don't know, the policy is such a nightmare because it's so big, and it gets so messy. But at the end of the day, there are so many people who benefit from even the smallest amount of on the ground work.
Yeah, and I think a lot of what, I seem to be hearing from all of you is kind of, you're pointing to like the institutions themselves and kind of their gendered nature, and how, maybe because kind of they're so separate and independent, not really, it's kind of reflecting, it makes me think of the SDGs even, how gender equality is number 5, but gender equality can occur without all the other SDGs being attacked. And also what we're speaking to is what we know about period poverty and what we don't know about period poverty, because epistemology and even what data is out there is so crucial for these policies, and even to what Jen was saying, we don't even know what about the high cost of disposable products. Would it be more beneficial for schools to invest in reusable products that then would go with a certain family or go with that child throughout their high school, throughout their schooling experience? There's like a lot of this kind of lack of data. So I wanted to ask you guys, what kind of role kind of gender plays in stigma around menstrual health, but in terms of kind of policies and ways that you have to address it. We're talking about how there seems to be less of a backlash from men when we're bringing menstrual equity to the table. But is that always the case, or how do you have to change what period poverty is, how it looks like, to kind of get across?
I'd love to jump in on this. I think gender plays a huge role in the stigmatization of anything that's female specific. I think it's because that is happening within a framework of power imbalances that just sort of permeates everything. So what the reality is that the male body and the male experience are the default, right? They're the default for everything, whether it's medical research. So as I was saying, hormonal fluctuations women have been excluded from medical trials because of hormonal fluctuations, rather than medical research looking to see what are the costs or benefits of hormonal fluctuations. So women have been deliberately excluded because of what is happening in the menstrual cycle in medical research. And so most of what we know in terms of medical data is about the male body, which is just, to me, that's astounding when you think about it, right? And this kind of male default just sort of trickles down through all the different sectors we've been talking about. So the number of public toilets available for males and females that are designated that way don't actually reflect the realities of how male and female bodies use toilets. And there's not even equality, let alone equity in that sort of infrastructure, in the sanitary and wash infrastructure. I think the other way that gender has kind of played into the stigmatization of menstruation is how the women's movement itself has responded to this issue. And Shira, you had raised, this idea of why hasn't this risen to the surface earlier as a key issue for the women's movement? And I think the reality is we've dealt with this stigmatization in different ways. So I'm in Jen's age group, and basically, for me as a young woman, for me to come to work and express any discomfort because I had my period was letting the side down. I could not let it be known that my period would affect my capabilities or my performance in any way, right? So in many ways, for me, that stigmatization was basically ignoring my period, and not acknowledging how it may be affecting me or what I needed to do if I needed to run out to buy tampons or change my clothes or whatever it was, so I think a large generation of the women's movement, that was the reality. And so it's the stigma plays out in different ways, right? And so now we have young women and girls who are speaking out more openly, who are just kind of shifting it in different ways and coming up against what it was Karen or Sophie who said, generations of stigma, right? So yes, we have the policy acknowledgement, but does anyone really want to talk about blood coming out of vaginas? And what that actually means and how it feels, and that's where the silences are now being broken in a way that is, I think, going to really affect public policy.
Just to jump in there, it was funny. I was just listening when you were talking about how the commercials, like, it was such a huge step to have, these commercials on TV, even just talking about menstruation. A lot of what, my generation has been kind of focused on is, why do they use blue liquid to show the absorbency of a product? So it's we're talking about these incremental changes, but also how does that shape, what if it was straight at the beginning? If this is like an internalized misogyny, internalized process, how do we get through to girls and women to kind of break that cycle? And, from keeping in mind, not all women and girls menstruate, and not all menstruators are women and girls.
And speaking to Shira's last point about, like, even if on paper people might be behind this movement, this idea of equality, you don't necessarily want to talk about, like, the physical, might squeamish parts of it. Like, speaking from personal experience, I testified once for the California State Assembly as we were attempting to remove our tampon tax. Eventually got nullified because our governor just put it in his budget. Sneaky workaround, kind of annoying, because then we have to redo it every 2 years. Not great. Another policy weird. It's ridiculous. But regardless, I was sitting in this room full of, like, tax committee adults, and they were discussing menstruation. And I was sitting there as an expert witness. I just turned 19. And oh no, I was still 18. I had not turned 19. And they were like, well, one of them literally made a joke about, like, oh, well, I really don't want to, like, hear about something that's gross or, like, icky. And, like, it was like a 60-year-old man. And I was like, well, I don't think you really also want to hear about the millions of kids in California who don't have access to tampons. So, like, buck up. And similarly, like, when our documentary was going through film festivals and then was up for the Oscars, there was a quote that got leaked to the press from an Academy voter who said, "I'm not voting for that documentary. That shit is nasty," like, talking about periods. And it was never revealed who. But even in a documentary which, like, there's no blood in it, there's nothing, like, there are no depictions of periods. It's literally just talking about the women and the machine and advocacy work and, like, women's empowerment. And this man could not get past the idea of menstruation. So yes, on paper, we have many male allies, and many people who don't menstruate are on board for the idea of menstrual equity. But the second they have to actually conceptualize the idea of what menstruating bodies go through every 4 weeks on average, it becomes much harder for them to actually sit there and think about it and want to continue to be a part of the movement. And I think that contributes a lot to the kind of gendered issue, because like, as Sia was saying, it's like it was the same conversation with maternity leave. If you showed any perceived weakness in the workplace, even a generation ago, even still in this generation, if for being, like, a woman or for women's issues, quote unquote, then you would not be perceived as valuable an employee. You were not as productive. Your capital value was not as high as your male counterparts, or even as women, your female counterparts who did not take those luxuries when really they're just, like, basic necessities. Um, and so gender plays a inherent role in this. And the second that people have to actually sit there and think about the implications of that, we lose a lot of male allies.
I think if we're going to wait, I mean, I'm not sure that this is such a generational conversation about those issues. I mean, a lot of these people just have to move out of the way and retire. And, I think that as younger people in a different generation replace them, the conversation will be different. I'm not sure that we're ever going to get older white men to really want to get in the weeds about menstruation and understand it. And I feel like I'm not sure I'm looking for understanding. I'm looking for human rights. I'm looking for respect. And I'm looking for you to vote and support a movement. Right. And so I think that like in Uganda, when I say that, including men in the conversation and educating boys, that's where I find the biggest opportunity to change is to bring those young men into our program and educate them. And they're not really squeamish about it. And then they kind of grow up with it. Right. And then also the way we bring men into the conversation is different. I'm not expecting them to want to know details and to get in the weeds about it and to really understand what it's like, but I'm expecting them to understand that this is a human rights issue, it's a gender justice issue, and we need you to support this movement, we need you to support this legislation, this policy change, we need you to support a program, we need you to support girls staying in school longer. This is a big part of it. And sometimes I feel like our expectations have to be realistic of who we're talking to and what we're trying to do. Again, is bring something to the table that is, affects over 50% of the population, happens every month. And it really isn't really up to whether you understand it or want to understand it or not. It's a justice issue. It's a human rights issue, period.
I think there is also sort of a pragmatic angle to that as well, Karen, because what we found with the officials in Maharashtra was if we could link our vision to their goals,
of course,
we would have more success, right? So if we say you want girls' attendance to go up in your schools, then do this. You want more girls to use the pads that you're offering, then make sure they're of a certain quality. You want
workplace attendance and things like that. Yeah,
sure. Exactly. And so so basically speaking their language, was
good public policy, right?
Absolutely. I completely agree. And I think especially as to the comment in the chat, including especially younger men in menstrual education and menstrual hygiene management workshops has been incredibly effective in kind of community adoption of these programs. In India especially, but also in Sierra Leone, we've seen a overwhelming adoption of cloth pads and a real willingness and like excitement about the idea of like menstrual equity in general, which has been like overwhelmingly awesome. They're one of our like most successful programs and closest partners. The community in Bombay, our organization that we work with is called Sierra Leone Rising. And I think especially, I guess my comments earlier were more pointed at legislators and, as Karen said, older white men in the US, I have found to be incredibly disappointing. But I think, again, another point is like the younger you bring in men into these conversations and kind of increase the topic of like what sex ed is on a international scale and what human development is, the easier that conversation becomes, because then it's just learning about bodies and learning about puberty and learning about what happens to the other half of the population. And as you said, it is just about basic human rights and decency and justice. And the earlier you start those conversations, the easier it is to adopt them.
I'd like to just speak to a point of sort of the other side of it, because the other group that we worked with in Maharashtra was women waste pickers. So most of the garbage collectors are informal workers. Most of them are what are designated as lower caste Dalit women. And so listening to the Waste Pickers Union in Pune City and hearing about what they are facing and what they understand about menstrual waste really sort of gave us a good environmental framework to think about in terms of how do we really address this issue? And in fact, there is no good way to dispose of disposable pads the way they are currently manufactured. Burning is incredibly toxic. Burying will get them, out of sight, but they're not going anywhere for a very long time. And often they're just ending up on dumps. And without citizen education, what's happening is that these informal waste pickers are actually being put at health risks because they're managing menstrual waste. So what we're trying to do is actually introduce some reusable methods. As Sophie mentioned, the washable cloth pads that are of a high quality, that are leak proof, but are environmentally sound. They are affordable. Introducing the idea of the menstrual cup, but not making assumptions that, oh, we can't do this here because it's against somebody's culture, when we haven't even taken the trouble to introduce those ideas or options, So in terms of thinking through what is a sustainable solution to period poverty, I think we can't ignore the environmental consequences as well.
So incredibly important. And when we set out to do this in northern Uganda, our goal was to make a environmentally friendly, biodegradable product. And we source everything locally and manufacture it locally. But the Ugandan government, in order for us to get the Ministry of Health approval, we had to use plastic, a certain grade of plastic that is really, it doesn't degrade. And, so it kind of like it's 87% biodegradable, but the rest of it is there's that little bit that's not. So you're so right. I teach environmental politics from time to time, and it's a huge issue. It's a huge issue layered on top of so many huge issues, right? Especially during COVID, a whole mountain of other issues have come to fruition, but that is really a huge issue that I almost feel where I work in the world, we haven't really had time to consider that yet, right? Like our resources have been into getting products and education and supply chains and all that kind of thing, and consistent use. And one of the issues with the reusable pad is many of our members don't have access to consistent clean water and soap. And when I was up in the refugee camp in South Sudan, they were using rags and different things, and they were like, we don't even have soap. So you can't, that wouldn't be an answer for a community like that or a situation like that. So it has to be multifaceted. It has to be, having different approaches to meeting different needs at different times, with the goal of, though, right, keeping the arsenal big, keeping the toolbox open, and not.
Thank you, Jen.
Yeah. So anyway, thank you.
Bye, Jen. Thank you. Absolutely, Karen. I completely agree. And I think, again, it's inherently dependent on which communities you're working with. A lot of what we found in terms of people inquiring about our work coming from the US and like inquiring about our international work is saying, like, well, why aren't you exclusively working with 100% environmentally sustainable, reusable products? And like, that would be inherently irresponsible of us to go to communities which are incredibly impoverished, who don't have access to clean water, drinking water most of the time, and say, here's a reusable menstrual cup, or here's a reusable washable cloth pad. Make sure you boil it once a month. Like, that's not fair of us. And there's a real aspect of kind of ignorance and classism in the kind of environmentalism movement that comes from the global West and from the US especially, that like we are one of the biggest contributors to the climate crisis we are facing, and yet we are pushing the responsibility onto developing communities to like be 100% sustainable and environmentally friendly right now. I'm like, you see the irony, right? And even in the US as well, in the work we do, like there are communities, I work very closely with this group in the US called No More Secrets. And it's a mother-daughter operation in Philadelphia. And they work with some of the hardest hit areas in Philadelphia and in Delaware and in Maryland. And the communities they're serving are 9, 10 people to a 1 bedroom house who do not have access to running water. And again, people are saying to them, well, they're in the US, you should be giving them menstrual cups, not pads and tampons, because they have plastic applicators and because it's bad for the environment, they're going to landfills. And Lynette, the woman who runs this operation, is always saying, like, well, until you see their lived reality and see that they just don't have access to any of the things that you would consider normal in the US and that they're living so far below the poverty line, then please butt out of their business. Like managing your period is such an inherently personal thing because it is about your body and it should be entirely about like your choice and, yourself. Doing a little dance now. But it really frustrates me when the topic of environmentalism comes up because yes, it is so inherently important and making decisions that are good for the environment is paramount. It is absolutely 100% key and needs to be part of every single conversation, but it needs to come from those who have the resources to make those decisions because it will always cost a little bit more and it will always come with a little bit extra hassle, at least right now. And even to purchase organic tampons or pads or to get those like subscription boxes that come to your door that are, always that are filled with the like, really good products that are like good for you and they don't have any fragrances or dyes and, all the marketing, like that costs more. And many people can't afford that. And that's really important to keep in mind. And so obviously, yes, it's incredibly important to, as much as you can, introduce programs that do include environmentalism and sustainable opportunities for communities across the globe. But at the end of the day, getting products into people's hands needs to be the first priority. And if they don't have running water, I'm not going to be an irresponsible piece of crap and say, here's a menstrual cup or here's a washable cloth pad that you can't wash. Have fun. Go have cervical infections and maybe get cancer. Like, no. I get very heated on that one, sorry.
So I have to run, but I did want to say, another thing is the commodification of menstrual products. I mean, we know how to have organic and non-toxic and, biodegradable menstrual products. That should be the goal, is to get those out there in the mainstream and not have them be expensive. Maybe menstruation shouldn't be a for-profit endeavor, and that's holding corporations accountable, right? And those are the kind of products that everybody should have access to, no matter what their income level is. And these other products shouldn't exist. I mean, there is that kind of non-capitalistic language and conversation that we should be having around this as well. That's a difficult one to have in the United States and elsewhere.
And once we start to have that conversation, legislators run scared. Yeah. They don't like it when we start talking non-capitalism.
Well, yeah, then it's socialism. But, some things shouldn't be a for-profit endeavor, and menstruation and women's health should be at the top of that list, and health in general. And it is really unfortunate that people who, are under-resourced and live in poverty have to have toxic, shitty products and potentially get sick from it. Or, if you're wealthy, you can afford the lovely environmental non-toxic products that are healthier. And there's something inherently wrong with that on its face. And I think that should be part of the conversation as well. Probably not today. We're not going to solve that one, but I would love to work with any of you. So I'm going to go, but it's really been a pleasure this morning hearing about all of your work. And Sia, I would love to talk to you about the waste pickers that you've worked with. That's something I'm really interested in. And so maybe we could connect off of this. But it was really nice to meet everybody and share.
And everyone join us for the living room session with Natalie.
We're already up and on Zoom, so you can just switch over to the living room session. Shira can put it in the chat. But anyway, thank you so much. And it was a pleasure. Bye.
Pleasure. Yes, I mean, just kind of jumping off of that, we don't even talk about like how much research and development is going into, these kind of products. What are we researching? What do we know? What's the data around here? So this has been a great conversation. I just want to invite any of our audience members here to send in a question or send in any comments, whether you want to do via the chat feature or put your camera on, maybe talking about what period poverty looks like in your area and how kind of what we've been talking about resonates and sits with you. Well, I'm not gonna force anyone. Won't probe too much. But I just wanted to talk with you both more about kind of this balance between if we're taking a global strategy to tackle period poverty and to end period poverty, how do we ensure that we're attacking it in an effective way and we're responding to needs of specific communities while also innovating and doing that research to figure out putting more money into data and research on reusable and biodegradable options. So like where's kind of the push to make the status quo more accessible to people or to change the status quo to be more sustainable?
I think it should happen at two levels. One is that because this is both an incredibly personal issue as well as a rights issue, I think it should happen in both sort of that private and public space, and making that private space safe enough to go public. So providing opportunities for girls, women, other genders who are menstruating to speak up about their experiences so that we are understanding the nuance, the complexity, the context, the individual needs. And that is really, that is the foundation that we build on as a movement, to allow for that complexity. And yes, we have to address immediate needs. That's critical. Sophie is absolutely right. That is the first step. But we can't move forward in a sustainable way that is really going to get at all the issues of period poverty if we're not allowing for complexity. The other piece that I would be remiss if I didn't mention is the SDGs. So the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, are lacking because they do not include goals on menstrual equity. However, they are a perfect multi-sectoral, multi-stakeholder framework that we can hold. Advocates in countries can hold their governments accountable. We can hold the global community accountable. We can hold UN agencies accountable. So it's a very useful framework that we can all get behind and use and leverage. And again, because it covers so many different sectors, we can easily see where the plugins are for menstrual equity. That's very clear. And even if they left them out, we don't have to. And that can really be a very useful tool. Thank you.
I agree with everything Sia said, as always. And I would just add that I think the menstrual equity space is ever growing, and I think something I hope to see more in the future through events like these and further collaborations is more of a coalition type environment in which we are sharing the work we're doing and really bringing it together to kind of build on that dual level that Sia was mentioning, because yes, it kind of has to run in tandem, because you need to be able to build out those legislative goals and those policy shifts and apply the SDGs and hold everyone accountable. But at the same time, you need to also be running the on-the-ground operations of getting people products and continuing to do research, and even that is a dual level operation. And so there are many incredible minds already in this movement, and there will be many more joining it, hopefully, I'm sure. And so I think rather it's a fairly siloed community, I think, in some ways, because there are people working all over the world, just so already, like, geographically it's rather isolated. I think if there's anything that COVID has been good for, it's showing that you don't need to be in the same space to work together. very effectively. And so I hope in the next year or so we can continue to work together and continue to bring more of the leaders in this space together to kind of create overarching goals and coalitions that can kind of really bring these two, I'm saying the word goals a lot, but goals together and advance them. And I think that is my hope for the future, is that we can all work simultaneously on achieving this, as opposed to siloing ourselves and stunting progress because of that.
Wow, thank you so much. This has been wonderful. I just want to read off some of like these amazing comments in the chat about how responding to period poverty has to be contextual. This is from Pratula, that we need to understand the context of communities we reach out to, specifically for those affected by wars and conflicts. It is so true. And then from Dorcas, we have educate people, listen to their reactions, and then being able to know how to approach them with your objective. It's crucial. I mean, a lot of the struggles that we all face in, you know, fighting against the patriarchy is how you make it digestible to them and attractive, and how you can push forward with your objective. But then also, you know, when in other communities with people who are still, you know, it's so crucial. So I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and thank our speakers so much for, you know, attending this conversation. It's been absolutely wonderful. And thank you, we've learned so much. And to everyone who's been on here, thank you. We have more events coming up. So today there's another event coming up on comparative discussion on the experiences of period poverty in South Africa and Kenya. And then later we have a conversation with a Chilean feminist activist about period poverty, as well as a conversation with a historian about period history. And then finally, a living room session with a musician. So all this information can be found on our website and on Eventbrite. And this has been wonderful. So I'm looking forward to seeing you all there, and keep in touch.
Thank you so much, Shira. Thank you, Sophie. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Zia, and thank you so much, Shira. This has been great. Have a great day, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.